Welcome everyone to another quick class on dynamic seating. Today we're going to be addressing shear. My name is Michelle Lang. Let's dive on in. So what is shear? Well, in wheelchair seating, shear occurs when there is displacement between the body's surfaces and the surfaces of the seating system. So they move in relation to one another. This can occur during transfers, as someone may be moving from a cushion surface to another surface, movement that occurs within the seating system, such as the client extending within a non-moving system, and movement of the seating system or wheelchair frame itself, such as during recline. Shear forces lead to deformation of the tissues themselves as they are compressed between these two moving surfaces, and this has been identified as a key pathway to pressure injuries. Specifically, when this displacement of tissue occurs, there's also friction, and this displacement leads to an actual bunching of the tissue. This can lead to a lack of adequate blood flow or lack of any blood flow to the top layer of the skin, and that can cause injury. Shear can also lead to a loss of client position as the client moves out of alignment with support surfaces and may not return to that alignment without assistance. What are the primary causes of shear forces within a wheelchair seating system? Well, first is recline. Recline leads to shear forces because, again, there is a displacement between the client's body and the seating support surfaces. There's a great deal of movement that occurs in recline. The client can go from an upright seated position all the way to supine. The client may be sliding down in their seating system, and that can cause the same issues. It might be that the client has a lot of increased muscle tone or movement patterns that cause the client to move out of alignment with the support surfaces. Now, clients who tend to have these movement patterns and a lot of muscle tone on board are not as likely to develop pressure injuries. However, we could still see shear as the client moves in relation to the support surfaces. We can also see a great deal of friction, which can lead to abrasions and rashes, particularly on the posterior trunk. And finally, we see a loss of position as the client moves out of alignment. Dynamic seating provides movement in the wheelchair, primarily at the hips, the knees, and the neck. The primary area of concern for shear is at the hips with the dynamic back. Do we see shear occurring when somebody is using a dynamic back? Well, the dynamic back works by opening the seat to back angle, and that's similar to recline. So is this a similar risk? Well, recline leads to shear forces because the pivot point is typically not close to the client's natural pivot point at the hip, and this tends to create shear forces. Some power recline systems try to address this by raising the pivot point in combination with allowing the back to move, slide down as the person reclines further back, and then slide back up as the person returns to upright to reduce this loss of alignment, but there is still some shear forces. In dynamic back design, there's two key design elements that help to reduce shear. First is that pivot point. So similar to our newer power recline systems, the pivot point is raised to be closer to the natural pivot point of the hip. Second is the degree of movement. Reclines, again, can go all the way to 180 degrees, where we can see movement of a dynamic back, the seating dynamics dynamic back in particular, at about 10 to 15 degrees. This is a much smaller degree of movement that still does the job, achieves the goal of the dynamic back without as much movement, reducing shear forces. Now, a lot of people who benefit from a dynamic back are creating a lot of shear forces in their static system. So if you look at the pictures here below, you can see that as the client extends, they're moving in relation to the support system. That's causing a loss of alignment, it's causing friction, it's causing shear. but dynamic seating can move with the client in response to these forces, maintaining much better alignment with the support surfaces and actually reducing shear. So for people who have a lot of extension, who have a lot of strong movement patterns, we can actually see a reduction in shear forces over what's already occurring in that static system. So what's the bottom line? Well, dynamic seating does not increase shear. Rather, it can decrease shear forces for many of the clients who benefit from dynamic seating. And dynamic seating can be a really important part of an overall plan to help keep the client in alignment with the support surfaces without a loss of position. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to reach out to Seating Dynamics or to myself directly. Thanks for joining us for this class, and I hope you join us for another one soon.